Hello, I'm Oliver Shem, the director of Castleton Galleries, and I'm here today with Ethan Pepin from the Rutland Regional Planning Commission to talk about the next show that is here at the Castleton University Bank Gallery. I'm excited to have this show, which was curated by Ethan, here at the Bank Gallery from now until August 12th. We have a reception on July 20th from 5:30 to 7:30. So I wanted to introduce you to Ethan, who's been with the Rutland Regional Planning Commission, and the title of the show is Mapping the Rutland Region. And it's a whole series of different maps about the Rutland itself, as well as the greater Rutland area, and really quite fascinating. And I have a few questions for you, Ethan. Specifically, what exactly is the organization of the show here at the Bank Gallery?
Sure, yeah, so the show is really divided into sort of two separate parts, or two wings, and those parts are related to each other but somewhat distinct. So when you first enter the gallery, on the right, you'll have an exhibit which focuses on the history of Rutland, how its form has changed over time, how the buildings, how the streets have changed during different eras of the city. So it really starts with, the pre-railroad Rutland, then the arrival of the railroad, and of course how the arrival of the automobile has shaped the city. So that is really the right side of the exhibit, and the left side of the exhibit focuses on sort of how government and politicians and leaguers and citizens have reacted to this changing times and changing technology, and how they've sought to actually proactively adopt and plan around these new technologies and figure out how best to integrate them into their cities. So that's really sort of the two parts of sort of how we got here and how people have planned around those changes and sought to really consciously adapt growth rather than just have growth happen.
Right. The planning seems so important and is still going on. I mean,
Absolutely.
This is actively what you do at the Planning Commission. Could you talk a little bit about your world there?
Sure. So we are really sort of the go-to resource for transportation planning. So that covers all sorts of things from programs which seek to improve our back roads through better ditching, better stormwater management, down to improving our downtowns, making them more pedestrian friendly, better. In fact, you can see if you look on Center Street, some of our work, the Planning Commission designed that street pilot, which involved bringing the parking out into the street, narrowing it to 10 feet to make it slower, and introducing parklets. So that was something that we worked on with the Downtown Rutland Partnership and the city, and that's an example of our work that you can see right there. But really, we sort of tackle anything. You might find me one day setting up a tube counter to count traffic because we've received a request about speeding and we're trying to get a better handle on the issue. So really, we work sort of all over in a bunch of different areas.
I think how much Vermonters drive and just how important it is, the flow of traffic, especially in an urban area. And I loved the parklets that you created. And this may be a whole nother topic, but I've heard that there's talk of possibly making it a whole pedestrian street here, Center Street?
Yeah, so there's certainly a talk about that. Right now, the city is currently looking at an engineering study to figure out sort of the utilities, because once you dig up a street, you really want to make sure you do all your work and do it right. And so when you put the street back together, you're not going to have to dig it up again.
Yeah.
So currently, that's where the project is out of the city. But yeah, they're really interested in going further, and I think continuing this sort of tactical urbanism push that they've done, which is to sort of test things out on a temporary basis with paint, with cones, maybe with a little parklets. And so, I think the city right now is considering shutting down the street temporarily to cars, seeing how that works. Is it affecting business? And if it's working, I think they're going to continue to monitor that, and they're going to consider potentially long-term pedestrianizing it. But really, the goal is to sort of continue to monitor and to test. And the old way of doing things was really, this high modernist idea where planners planned and they came up with these great highway maps and they sort of imposed them on the world and these sort of grand designs. But now we're really sort of much more looking at how can we sort of test things and get community feedback and sort of go back and forth and have a sort of iterative process, which allows us to sort of reach a final design while fully sort of comprehending what it's actually going to do when it's in place, rather than just sort of arguing about a line on a map or a set of plans.
Right.
It's sort of a way that lets people actually see and sort of feel what it's like. So
How it is on the ground.
Exactly.
How it functions.
Yep.
And it feels like it's more human, this idea of you're focused more on the pedestrian and moving around the downtown. Not to get too far into the weeds, but I find this absolutely fascinating. And when Ethan came to me with this proposal for this show, I was like, absolutely. I love Rutland, and I love trying to identify how it's evolved from, the different parts, what it was like before the train. You were saying that before the train, the center of the town was up by like the Chaffee Art Center, the city park, the town park up there, and how it kind of moved down here and the orientation of the town changed. So there are maps that specify that. You can see the downtown in 1852 or so, how sparsely, this downtown, how sparsely it was populated, or how many buildings there were. And then within 14 years, I think there was another map, how just the growth exploded. How did you find yourself developing this idea for the show, and all these maps from different time periods?
Definitely, that's a great question, and it really came from a variety of factors, and it's hard to really pick one. For one, we had our longtime GIS manager, GIS is a mapping software for anyone who doesn't know, who developed all kinds of maps and plans around the Rutland region from early 90s to today. And he had really just collected a ton of materials over the 3 decades he'd been working there. And when he passed away, really quite tragically, we had to clean out his office, and we found all these sort of amazing old documents and stuff. So you have these 1973 maps by the RBC, and I didn't want to just show historical maps. I really wanted to also create modern maps that sort of represent the organization today.
Yeah.
Something that really exciting happened is we did bring on a new mapping expert, Nick Stark, who's our GIS planner, and he really brings a lot of graphic design sense and that sort of really visual sort of design sense to this mapping program, which is really great. And I had him come up with 2 maps that I was really excited to develop, which show really clearly that kind of historical change over time, which is sort of the goal of the exhibit. And the one we're standing in right now actually shows Main Street and Woodstock Avenue, today also known by US 4 and US 7, how those used to be really the main street sort of boulevard of Rutland. And you can see that driving down, especially South Main, there's all these gorgeous old homes, many of which have been since chopped up and turned into apartments. But you can just really clearly see, especially the section between West Street and Woodstock has almost completely been obliterated. There's almost nothing left of the original form there. And that was really the original village center. Main Street Park, that was our village green. This is where the center of the community was, and that whole sort of historical area has been completely rewritten as this sort of boulevard. Main Street has been slowly evolved into a highway corridor, and there's been greater and greater traffic volumes, which has just led to it being increasingly less desirable, and a lot of these beautiful old buildings sort of falling into disrepair.
It's amazing to me to see right there, that's the town. What is that specific name for that? Town Park?
Town Green.
Town
that
Green.
Was the original name.
The Town Green right in there.
Yeah, it was back in England. You always had the commons, and that was sort of the one place where everybody owned it. And originally, it was the place where you used to graze your sheep, right?
Sure.
Because you couldn't graze it on the aristocrats' land because they owned it and they wouldn't let you. So you needed this common space where people could come, and that sort of being in New England, we really brought that tradition with us. But a really sort of interesting and sad fact is that a lot of these village greens were right along roadways, and this sort of similar historical process where these roads have had to get wider and wider, and they've carried greater and greater traffic has led to a lot of their sort of traditional village greens getting eroded as the highway gets into them. So a lot of our communities actually in Rutland region, you may not be able to recognize their village greens because they've been so truncated. Like, for example, you go up to Brandon, you can see the village green is actually right along US 7 through Brandon. It's the little tiny green patch.
I was wondering. So that was the original one?
Yeah, there's a parking lot behind. So that was the original green. It used to be bigger, but as the highway has sort of fully taken over, that's led to that space decreasing. And really, the community that has the only really fully preserved village green from that era is Fairhaven, which has sort of this massive village green. So that you go to Fairhaven, you can sort of see what some of these towns might look closer to.
What I find also interesting, I think we were talking about this before, but there's a marker right in here talking about the Fort Rutland being there originally, and I would imagine that would be in the 1750s, 1760s, which is kind of crazy to think about that.
Yeah, the late 1700s. In fact, I think the legislature used to meet here briefly before they decamped for Montpelier, because Rutland really was, for a long time, kind of the center of political power in Vermont. You know, initially it was sort of the large southern city, and then as the marble industry really took on this huge prominence and huge economic weight. I mean, the Vermont Marble Corporation was, I think, the wealthiest corporation in the world at one time. Huge. It supplied marble to Washington, D.C. to build all those beautiful monuments. So it really had a humongous impact, and the money and wealth that was generated really built this downtown. It built Rutland, and it sort of cemented Rutland as the preeminent city in Vermont for many of years until the marble industry started to decline really in the 50s and the 60s and 70s. And that's sort of the period whence Burlington started to rise and became sort of the new center of political power in Vermont. And then I found even more that were locked in our basement, and sort of I thought, there's some really cool stuff here, and it's a shame that it's all sort of sitting away, locked in cabinets, and no one can really see it. So I really wanted to put that on public display. So that was sort of the initial idea. And then I actually attended an event here at the gallery, and I saw the gallery, and I thought, it was the perfect space because you have these beautiful windows, you have this historic building right in the core of downtown. Actually, you look out these windows, and 100 years ago there used to be a train depot right there. You used to be bustling with activity, and now you can see it's a shopping center. So really, just looking out the windows, you can really see how that change has happened. So that was sort of really the impetus for that. But the other really driving factor is just I got into planning through history. I was really just fascinated by looking at cities and how much they've changed, and especially, American cities have undergone some pretty dramatic changes since the 1940s, and sort of understanding that and then having conversations with people where they don't seem to really grasp that change because they haven't been able to see it. So me really trying to think of how can I illustrate this change and show it to people in a way that's potentially more tangible? And I'm a very sort of visual learner by nature, so that's how I sort of came up with the idea, well, why don't we show, maps? And you can see tangibly as the city grows and changes over time, and as sort of the buildings change form and the street grids change as we go from sort of this grid system in the age of sort of the streetcar and the rail to this sort of modern cul-de-sac suburban street pattern. And you can really see that change quite dramatically, but it can be really hard to grasp for a lot of people. So
yeah, and there are multiple different maps that show the very evidence of that, the changing of the transportation, but also the society itself. So can we talk a little bit about some of the hand-colored maps as well as the newly created maps by one of your colleagues?
Definitely. Yeah, so it's actually kind of interesting bookend there because the 1973 maps were developed for our office originally for the RRPC, and they've been sitting there for a long time. And today we have a staff member doing that as well, so it's exciting to see that parallels. But the 1970s maps, those were developed as part of this really exciting, it was called an ecological planning study.
Right.
And the idea was to really look at all the factors of the natural world, your vulnerability to, say, flooding hazards, where sort of buildable space was, where you had generally flat ground, sort of say, what areas are most suitable for agricultural because they have good soil, what areas are most suitable for, say, timber harvesting, and then what areas are most suitable for development due to generally flat ground, the existence of groundwater sources, sewage, and all these other things. And that sort of was really an early version of the computer mapping software we call GIS. And all these maps were essentially developed painstakingly over the course of 3 years. And he went into actual books and he looked up all the data and he mapped like elevation, soil, all this stuff, and then turned them into these transparent papers that he then laid on top of each other to sort of allow him to see all the data and how it started to fit together. So one really interesting thing you can see is there's a natural hazard vulnerability map, which shows all the areas in 1973 which were identified as potentially very vulnerable in a natural disaster. And you can see very clearly on that map, there's a section of US 4 through Mendon, which today you can see a little painted rock memorial because during Tropical Storm Irene, that whole section blew right out. And
Yeah.
you can see that identified hazard right there was just so clear, and yet nothing had really been done about it. So I found that sort of really interesting. But the other interesting thing about that is the person who made them, his name is Stephen Durkee. He actually still lives in the region. He lives in Killington right now. So just to have that sort of, 5 decades ago, this fascinating studying, which was really cutting edge at the time, it's the kind of stuff that we're starting to get back to now, 50 years later, which is really surprising. So wanting to sort of put those on display and be able to actually talk to him and hear him explain sort of the history behind it really made me interested in putting them on.
Yeah, I love the idea that Stephen Durkee is there in Killington. We're trying to get him to come here for the reception, which is July 20th. I love the idea of him being here to be able to answer questions and talk about his painstaking work of collecting information. And then I love the idea of putting all this data into a physical manifestation that you can understand. And that's what this show is all about. Rutland and the physical mapping of the region created by Nick Stark and Stephen Durkee, and this has all been put together by Ethan Pepin. And the Castleton Bank Gallery is honored to be able to have this show and to share it with the public. Thank you very much. Show goes on from today to August 12th, and the reception is July 20th at 5:30 to 7:30. See you there.